I was just thinking, I don't know, about the colors that came up when I had this on there. Why would it be green? It's reflecting the green light there. So mystery solved. Mystery number 2. Where's my book? It is day 234 in the classroom. That is not a mystery any longer. I am Dr. Annette Feravich. That is not a mystery any longer. But this is. I mean, it's not a mystery. This is not a mystery either. Ooh. Okay, so it is August 19th, and I really don't know where my book is. Why'd you get online? Well, I started it and then I realized I probably should get up and start looking. So I'll be right back. Well, I'll leave. I'll put our be right back new sign. That means every classroom got to see our new be right back sign. So spent a little time on this. Let me go find my book. I'll give you some music though. The Flight from Ireland. The Flight from Ireland. I have to work on it. I didn't know that was coming up next. The Flight from Ireland. Oh yeah. Is that the part she's been denying? Her Irish heritage. Her great-great-grandmother had red hair. Nope, that wasn't it. Oh, yeah. So here we have a young seamstress. Young seamstresses work on Irish lace, New York City, 1912. And so here she is, though she could, knitting away at her lace, right? So let's just see. America's ethnic landscape changed in the first part of the 19th century. Native Americans removed from their traditional homelands were driven onto reservations in the West. African American slavery expanded in the South. At the same time, a great flow of immigrants from Ireland, more than half of them women, reached American shores. The Irish newcomers struggled to find their place in a society that was hungry for their labor, but treated them with scorn. Along the way, Irish Americans sometimes came into competition or conflict with other ethnic minorities, even though they faced some of the same obstacles. Beef for Britain. The Irish immigrants thought of themselves as exiles who had been forced to flee from a homeland they loved. Time and again, they complained that they were pushed out of their country by English oppressors. The large-scale emigration from Ireland in the 19th century was deeply rooted in a long history of English oppression. Beginning in the 12th century, the English conquest of Ireland caused Irish land to be seized and transferred to colonizers from England. By 1700, the Irish owned only 14% of Ireland. Farmers had to rent or lease land from English landowners in order to grow food for their families. Things got worse. In the 18th century, when the English landlords decided to make their Irish properties more profitable, beef was in high demand in Britain, so the landlords began to switch from farming to cattle ranching. Farmers' fields were fenced off for use as cattle pastures, and peasants were thrown out of their homes. Eventually, 90% of the laborers who had once been needed to plant and harvest crops found themselves out of work. Ireland became a land of extremely poor tenants who lived on other people's land in dirty hovels of mud and straw and clothed only in rags, according to Benjamin Franklin, who visited in 1771. But by the 1830s, Ireland was profiting from the sale of its beef, but the common people had been reduced to wretchedness. Families huddled in huts, sharing a single bed of straw while living on a diet of potatoes. The Great Famine. There was an alternative to the misery of life in Ireland. By the thousands, Irish people were leaving for America. Letters sent to family and friends back home in Ireland told of the wealth, I'm not getting it right, and opportunity available in the United States, where there was no tyranny or oppression from landlords. Between 1815 and 1845, 1 million Irish came to America. Still, most Irish hated the thought of leaving Ireland, so they endured their hardships at home. They became migrant workers in their own country, leaving their cottages each spring to seek construction or agricultural work, and then returning to their families in the fall with their rent money sewn inside their clothes. That's interesting too, isn't it? You always want to see what they're doing with their money. Are they working and then drinking it away, or are they literally bringing it back to their families? Still, most Irish hated the thought of leaving Ireland, so they endured their hardships at home. I already read that. Construction, agriculture, rent, money sewn in their clothes. Earnings were meager, but they were enough to rent a small plot of land on which to grow potatoes. Then, in 1845, a little-known fungus appeared and changed the course of Irish history. This blight or disease attacked potatoes. 40% of the crop rotted in the ground that first year. So again, the same kinds of strategies, bringing disease, right? Dis-ease. The deadly blight came back year after year until 1854, destroying the main food source of the Irish peasants. By 1855, 1 million people had died of starvation and disease in the Great Famine. For many landlords, the famine was a chance to turn even more of their property into fields for grazing. Peasants who could not pay their rent were turned out of their huts. The landlords kept shipping beef and grain to British markets, while the starving Irish peasants wandered the countryside like famished and ghastly skeletons, and families ate seaweed in a desperate attempt to stay alive. Now, this is reminding me of Jimmy Carter and his Peanuts. It absolutely reminds me of him and his Peanuts, with the whole area of Georgia, the idea of the historic spirits in that South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia area, although Georgia was so hot. Oh my gosh. And I could literally hear him like saying, you thought it was bad, the potatoes? Now you can work for peanuts. I could literally hear that. And families ate seaweed in a desperate attempt to stay alive. And who knew? Who knew what? How God would turn something for good. Right? How he would turn something for good. So seaweed has all of that iodine in it, and all of that iodine kept away thyroid problems because they had the appropriate amount of vitamin D in their systems. They were able to remain really quite healthy, that their thyroid was functioning okay despite the loss of weight. That's what it seems like to me. In a panic, 1.5 million more Irish fled to the United States during the Great Famine. Barely able to scrape together money for their passage, they traveled on crowded ships, crammed together below deck on plywood shelves. Tens of thousands sickened and died during the passage or immediately afterward. Even after the potato blight had retreated, Irish peasants emigrated from their poverty-stricken homeland. Between 1855 and 1900, 2 million more emigrated to the United States. And you can see the play of language here. Because every time I read the word peasants, you're reminded of the word peanuts. So when you come there and you say Irish peasant, Irish, and do you understand what I'm saying? So you're saying the class of people that you are when you're coming into Ellis Island in a language that the people there understand. Irish peasant means they work for peanuts. Send them to, right? We'll see if that's true in our experiment in New York. Irish peasants, do they work for peanuts? See? And remember, they're twisting my words too. That is right. So no. We are not saying no. Irish peasants should work for peanuts. Nobody should work for peanuts. No. We have to understand the language. We have to understand the language. For many landlords, the famine was a chance to turn even more of their property. Sorry, hold on just a minute. The deadly blight came back year after year until 1854, destroying the main food source of the Irish peasants. So can you imagine that? Year after year, who has that kind of luck? I'm sorry, what was that? Those people in the Great Plains? Okay, that's an area. You could have area of bad weather, but what about, a people? Do we really have to go there? Aren't we reading that? Full circle. For many landlords, the famine was a chance to turn even more. Oh, sorry, forgot the line I have highlighted. By 1855, 1 million people had died of starvation and disease in the Great Famine. So this is, again, a script. And what do? They inspire their artists to write by putting the screws to them, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. For many landlords, the famine, can you think of a new way to put the screws to people, right? That's not an invitation. It's not a game. That's just for anuses. For many landlords, the famine was a chance to turn even more of their property into fields for grazing. Peasants who could not pay their rent were turned out of their huts. The landlord kept shipping beef and grain to British markets, while the starving Irish peasants wandered the countryside like famished and ghastly skeletons. Oh, and family ate seaweed in a desperate attempt to stay alive. Jeez. In a panic, 1.5 million more Irish fled to the United States during the Great Famine. Barely able to scrape together money for their passage, they traveled on crowded ships, crammed together below deck on plywood shelves. Tens of thousands sickened and died during the passage, or immediately afterward. All right, where am I? Is that where I'm at? Even after the potato blight had retreated, Irish peasants emigrated from their poverty-stricken homeland. Between 1855 and 1900, 2 million more emigrated to the United States. So you've got 3 million. No, 1 million died. We said from 1815. There it is. 1 million Irish. All right, to 1845 came, but then 1 million died, right? So here we have population control through starvation and disease, right? An army of workers, pushed from Ireland by famine and hardship, the immigrants were pulled to America by the opportunity for jobs. They provided labor for the grand building projects that were knitting the United States together, its roads, canals, and railroads. Watching these laborers work on the national road in Pennsylvania, a farmer described them as an immoral Irish brigade, 1,000 strong, with their carts, wheelbarrows, picks, shovels, and blasting tools, grading the commons and climbing the mountainside, leaving behind them a roadway good enough for an emperor to travel over. They might know that in Ireland, since the King of England made sure that the roads weren't bumpy. The Irish helped build the Erie Canal in Michigan, Ohio border. But I don't know if the canal's on Michigan, Canada. I'm not sure. And thousands of miles of railways. But they became disposable workers. They had high accident rates because they were often assigned to do the most hazardous jobs. Irish miners in Pennsylvania coal mines destroyed their lungs breathing black dust. The many deaths of railroad workers gave rise to a saying, "An Irishman is buried under every tie." Under every tie. Look at the ties. What are they? 12 feet long? I think so. America turned out to be a nightmare for many Irish immigrants. They complained of being treated like dogs or worse, despised and kicked about. A song told of their disappointment. I got a letter from a relation telling me to hasten across the sea, that gold was to be found in plenty there, and that I'd never have a hard day or a poor one again. Alas, when I landed, I made for the city without delay, but I never saw gold on the street corners. Alas, I was a poor, aimless person cast adrift. Against other workers. And you could see how the Irish Gaelic accent would have turned into the Southern accent, right? And then how a Southern Irishman would have teamed up with an African American pretty relatively easily. Tell a story. An Irishman loves a good story, doesn't he? We all love a good story. The Irish immigrants found themselves not against other workers. The Irish immigrants found themselves not only exploited as laborers, but also pitted against Chinese and black workers. One clash took place in New England where Irish workers in the shoemaking industry struggled against low wages. They also opposed the introduction of factory machines that reduced the need for labor. In order to speak with a united voice, the workers formed a union called the Knights of St. Crispin. The Crispins quickly became the country's largest labor organization with 50,000 members by 1870. Demanding higher pay and a workday of only 8 hours, the Crispins in a factory in North Adams, Massachusetts, went on strike, refusing to work until the factory owner agreed to negotiate with them. Instead, the owner brought in 75 Chinese workers from San Francisco to replace the striking Crispins. The Chinese workers were housed in dormitories inside the locked and guarded factory yard. Within 3 months, they were manufacturing more shoes than the same number of white workers had been producing before the strike, which increased profits for their factory owner. Newspapers hailed their owner's move as a success. The factory owner's action had a sobering effect on workers striking at nearby shoe factories. 10 days after the Chinese workers arrived, the strikers at the other factories, fearful of losing their jobs, went back to work at a 10% pay cut. A magazine suggested that business owners might find Chinese workers to be the solution to the problem of unions and organized labor in the United States. The Chinese were held up as a model for Irish laborers. Chinese workers were said to be harder working and quicker to learn than the Irish. The Irish immigrant laborers were also believed to be savage and uncivilized and to lack intelligence and self-control. In a sermon called The Dangerous Classes in Society, Reverend Theodore Parker of Boston claimed that some people were inferior in nature. These lower beings, he said, were Negroes, Indians, Mexicans, Irish, and the like. In Ireland, people had seen parallels between their own lives as slaves of the British and the lives of the enslaved and oppressed American blacks. In 1842, for example, thousands of Irish citizens signed an anti-slavery petition that called blacks their equals and brothers. But when the Irish crossed the Atlantic, they seemed to lose their sympathy for African Americans. In America, many of them became anti-black. As they competed against blacks for jobs, Irish immigrants called attention to their race. In a country of the whites, they asked, shouldn't white workers be chosen over blacks? Because many white Protestant Americans despise the Irish as Catholics and foreigners, Irish newcomers tried to become insiders, to be accepted as Americans by showing their fellow whites that they too were hostile to blacks. Identifying African Americans as the other was a way for the Irish to assimilate or blend into white society. So they were the narcs. African Americans reacted to Irish hostility with their own anti-Irish complaints. They resented being told by the Irish to go back to Africa, a place they had never seen. They claimed that the Irish foreigners took jobs from American-born people. Black journalist John E. Bruce wrote, "It is to be regretted that in America, where the outcasts, the scum of European society, can come and enjoy the fullest social and political privileges, the native-born American with wool hair and dark complexion is made the victim." I wasn't sure who was saying that. The black journalist. Sorry for the accent crossover. The Irish had felt the sting of English prejudice and oppression in Ireland. In America, they often turned their rage against others on the lower ranks of society's pecking order. Their hostility toward blacks exploded during the Civil War when Democratic politicians warned the Republicans were willing to sacrifice the lives of Irish soldiers in order to free the slaves who would then be brought north to steal the work and the bread of the honest Irish. Fired up by such fears, Irish rioters turned on blacks in New York City in July 1863. The people doing that, scientists. Without a doubt, I've read enough books on class separation and the ideology, the psychology behind class separation. I've read enough about it, And that's exactly what they're doing there. Class separation. Okay. Firing classes up. Calling attention to race through color alone, and then firing people up. You can't get two more distinct races as far as color goes, right? Not personality, not experience. So you can see the scientific experiment behind this. 4 days of rioting ended only when an army regiment arrived to restore order. More than 100 people had been killed. So that was 1863, a riot in 1863. I think that would basically be the first union riot without ever being called a labor union, right? A massive migration of women. Labor competition between Irish and blacks was fierce in the domestic services. In 1830, the majority of the maids, house cleaners, cooks, and other servants in New York City were black. 20 years later, Irish women filled a majority of domestic service jobs. The daughters of Irish farmers did not just become maids in America, however. They also became factory workers in textile towns such as Lowell, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island. More than half of the Irish immigrants were women. In contrast, women made up just 21% of the immigrants from southern Italy and 4% of those from Greece. This massive flight of women from Ireland meant that by 1867, Irish women outnumbered Irish men in New York City, 117,000 to 87,000. And they're in high demand, so they're making the cashola for the families, making the Irish men want to drink. Irish women left their homeland because economic conditions there hit them especially hard. After about 1815, it became common for farmers to leave their land to just one son, rather than dividing it up among their children, except to emigrate. This meant that there were fewer men in Ireland who could afford to get married. Young women found their chances of marriage extremely limited unless their families could afford dowries, money that would go to their husbands' families. Marriage rates declined, so did the market for goods produced by small cottage-based manufacturing, such as weaving, which had traditionally been a source of income for women. As a result of these two trends, thousands of women were shut out of Ireland's economy. And do you see that? Who's the producers and who are the drunks? Possibilities for both money and then who are maligned. Possibilities for both money and marriage, however, waited for Irish girls on the other side of the Atlantic. Women without dowries could find husbands in America. They could also find jobs, especially as maids. Irish women were more likely to enter domestic service than women of other immigrant groups. In part, this was because women of other nationalities often came to America with their husbands or fathers, while many Irish immigrant women were unmarried and unattached to families. As domestic servants, they would receive housing and meals as well as wages. Service work offered more than shelter, food, and money, however. It was also an introduction to the new culture in which the immigrants found themselves. These young women had come to the United States to settle permanently. Living with their employers helped them adapt to their new society by giving them an inside look at middle-class America. So here their employers are now getting a taste of white women, very white women, right? Instead of all the African slaves inside the home, acting like women. Seems to me they couldn't keep their hands off of them. But and they're not from lower class, they're from the middle class, so that's okay. They can still be treated as servants. However, I don't mind their presence, right? But while they lived inside American homes, maids were still outsiders, far away from their own families. Some servants hungered for closeness with their families they served, but often they were ignored. What I minded was the awful lonesomeness, recalled one former maid. The family members had nothing to do with her except to give her orders. It got to feel sort of crushing at last. The work was demanding too. Domestic servants cooked, cleaned, cared for the children, climbed stairs endlessly, and were expected to be on call around the clock. This lack of personal freedom led one woman to choose factory work over service. It's freedom that we want when the day's work is done. I know some nice girls that make more money and dress better and everything for being in service, but they're never sure of 1 minute that's their own when they're in the house. Our day at the factory is 10 hours long, but when it's done, and we can do what we like with the evenings. But factory labor was also hard to endure. The textile mills of New England, where Irish women were a large part of the workforce, were dusty and noisy. Working conditions were dangerous. In 1860, for example, a mill in Lowell collapsed, trapping 900 workers. A fire broke out, which is always the added fuel to it problem, right? Adding to the terror and devastation. 88 people died. Watch a couple of those movies, because without a doubt, they have created a terror, and they filmed it without a doubt. There was the terror of the scene on Little House on the Prairie where the blind children were running out of the house, and the mother, not the mother, because that was Laura Ingalls, not Laura, that was Mary Ingalls, but her and her husband's baby, they were in the fire in that. So, but you know, here we have knowledge about the possibility of everlasting life, and then the horror of treating that life as if it's just either a cinematic success or not, which really seems to be what is going on. Irish women were heavily employed in the sewing trades. No female that can handle a needle need be idle. One of them wrote home. By 1900, a third of all seamstresses and dressmakers in the United States were Irish women. Like jobs in the textile factories, though, sewing work was often exhausting, dirty, and repetitive. Still, for many Irish women, America really was a land of opportunity. A daughter wrote home to her father in 1850 to say, "This is a good place and a good country." America represented not only jobs and wages, but also self-sufficiency, a chance for women to take care of themselves without depending on husbands or fathers. As one of them wrote to a younger sister still in Ireland, "I am getting along splendid and likes my work. It seems like a new life." Irish power. Irish immigrant women were mainly limited to domestic service or factory work. I'll get this over here. But their daughters had more choices. In 1900, 61% of Irish women who had immigrated were seamstresses or laundresses, but only 19% of the Irish women who had been born in America followed those trades. Irish American daughters were getting educations and entering white-collar jobs such as teaching, nursing, and secretarial work. Advances for Irish women reflected a broader pattern of Irish success as the second generation moved up the social and economic ladder. The family of John Kearney of Poughkeepsie, New York, is an example of that pattern. Kearney emigrated from Ireland to America, where he worked first as an unskilled laborer and then as a junk dealer. One of his sons rose from postal clerk to superintendent of city streets, and another started as a grocery clerk and eventually became the inspector of the city's waterworks. The fact that the Irish were white helped them assimilate into the mainstream. While immigrants could become naturalized citizens, white young people could apply to the best colleges and universities. The Chinese were prevented by racial laws from becoming naturalized citizens, and large numbers of African Americans had their right to vote stripped away. But Irish Americans had suffrage, and they used their right to vote to gain political power. In urban areas with large Irish population, including New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, Irish voters supported Irish candidates. By 1890, the Irish had captured most of Democratic Party organizations in northern cities. Mayors and city councilmen, in turn, rewarded voters with jobs in police and fire departments, city-owned subways and ports, and in City Hall itself. Here again, a young seamstress's work on Irish lace, New York City, 1812. So there's two little girls there. And I also remember that picture as being in Fremont's old-fashioned days. So we had my sister in the bathtub who was naked on top for people to peer and look. And then they had, I think, my cousins sitting there sewing lace. In urban areas with large Irish populations, Irish political bosses also awarded public works projects to Irish-owned construction companies. At the same time, ethnic associations for people of Irish descent served as job networks in which people helped each other find work. Through these ethnic strategies, Irish Americans cooperated with each other to rise from rags to riches. At the same time, though, the success of the Irish Americans challenged the sense of ethnic identity and unity. Some immigrants urged each other to teach their children Gaelic, the Irish language. They wanted Irish Americans to keep alive their connection to Ireland and its history. Other Irish Americans, however, celebrated the fact that life in the United States was different from the old life. One immigrant said, "The second generation here are not interested in their ancestors. We have never told them of the realities of life in Ireland and would not encourage any of them to visit. When we left there, we left the old world behind and are all American citizens and proud of it." Leads a children's crusade. So here is our example. All right. Mary Harris was one of several million Irish girls who emigrated to the United States. Later in life, when she was known as Mother Jones, she fought for the rights of American workers, including children. Her activism on behalf of the working class led one lawyer to call her the most dangerous woman in America. And I remember that magazine. It feels like, I don't know. I remember it from when it was the first magazine I bought, Mother Jones. It was. Because I thought I was Mother Earth. Mary was born in the Irish city of Cork in 1837. When she was 14 or 15, her family left Ireland for Canada, then later moved to the United States. Mary became a school teacher and dressmaker. She married George Jones, the organizer of a labor union for iron workers. After Mary Harris Jones lost her husband and their 4 children to disease and lost her home and dress shop in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, she got involved in the labor movement that was sweeping the nation as working people fought for safer job conditions and better pay. She organized support for labor unions and helped lead workers' strikes. Recognizing that labor struggles affected whole families, she got the strikers' wives and children to march in public displays of support for the union cause. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was still legal to employ children in mines and mills. Some children worked for up to 60 hours a week for low wages. Bitterly oppressed to this exploitation, in 1903, Jones organized a march of about 200 people, many of them child workers. Over several weeks, they marched from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to the home of President Theodore Roosevelt in Oyster Bay, New York. The young people sitting there eating their oysters, you know GD well they were. The young people, not that I haven't been there or whatever. The young people carried banners with slogans such as, "We want to go to school, not to mines." In speeches along the way, she delivered to a crowd in Coney Island is known as the Wall of the Children. It begins. After a long and weary march with more miles to travel, we are on our way to see President Roosevelt at Oyster Bay. We will ask him to recommend the passage of a bill by Congress to protect children against the greed of the manufacturer. We want him to hear the wail of the children who never have a chance to go to school, but work from 10 to 11 hours a day in the textile mills of Philadelphia, weaving the carpets that he and you walk on, and the curtains and clothes of the people. 50 years ago, there was a cry against slavery, and the men of the North gave up their lives to stop the selling of black children on the block. Today, the white child is sold for $2 a week, and even by his parents, to the manufacturer. We will ask in the name of the aching hearts of these little ones that they be emancipated. I will tell the president that I saw men in Madison Square last night sleeping on the benches, and that the country can have no greatness while one unfortunate lies out at night without a bed to sleep on. That's right, because that ain't the United States of America if you have one poor unfortunate sleeping out on a bench. I will tell him that the prosperity he boasts of is the prosperity of the rich, wrung from the poor. In Georgia, where children work day and night in the cotton mills, they have just passed a bill to protect songbirds. What about the song? What about the little children from whom all song is gone? You are told that every American-born male citizen has a chance of being president. I tell you that the hungry man without a bed in the park would sell his chance for a good square meal. And these little toilers, deformed, dwarfed in body, soul, and morality, with nothing but toil before them and no chance for schooling, don't even have the dream that they might someday have a chance at the presidential chair. I think I've read this several times. It feels so familiar to me. Children's Crusade, as Mother Jones's march was called, failed to achieve its goal of a meeting with the president. He wouldn't even meet with the children. But it drew public attention to the issue of putting children to work. Historians of the labor movement in America called the Children's Crusade, led by an immigrant woman from Ireland, an important early step toward better child labor laws. Now that's one GD mother. That's for GD sure. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thank you so much for joining me here in the classroom. We are done with day 1 of our 3 days on. I will see you, if God will have it, tomorrow on day 235 of the classroom. Thanks so much for joining me as we help you get a healthier mind, a healthier body, and a healthier spirit here in the classroom. Thanks.